So if you're playing things like Farewell or Wrath of God or Day of Judgment, these things that destroy all the creatures, you're actually hurting yourself because you are destroying some of your resources, which are your opponent's creatures.
Distraction makers.
We've talked a lot about the play patterns that emerge in Commander. We've talked a lot about the bystander effect, where you are advantaged by having your opponents fight against each other and you staying out of it. We've talked about you interacting with another player is actually hurting both you and them. So I got to thinking about, all right, well, what are some types of cards that operate within those axes, right? How do I win the game by doing the least possible? So I thought we should talk a little bit about how fogs might secretly be the best cards in Commander, combat-focused Commander, to be clear.
I think that's a very clear distinction.
Yeah, they don't do much when somebody's playing a Thassa's Oracle.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's funny because we talked about, generally what is the system of Commander at its most extreme. It's CEDH. And CEDH is primarily some sort of a hand combo that you are trying to protect, play out, use counter spells to protect your combo so that you go off and you win the game and no one else did anything. It's not often that you have a large board with lots of things on it. Sometimes that happens, but it's not very common. And so, yeah, if you're saying I prevent all damage dealt and someone says, too bad I win the game, then it doesn't make a huge impact in the long run.
We'll get to the card that does see play.
Sure.
Later.
Right. For now, though, yeah, I think I was looking at various fog decks before we were recording this, and I personally really want to make a fog deck now for Commander.
It's going to be awful.
I think it's going to be really fun. I'm going to have a great time.
Well, there is an archetype that already exists that sort of works this way called Pillow Fort, which basically is you're trying to play a bunch of enchantments and things that deter your opponents from attacking you.
Right.
But
that's not really...
It's not... right. The biggest issue, I think, is that you're giving information by playing a permanence to the board. So what we're talking about, I think, is sort of a Pillow Fort deck idea, but you're not... You get to keep all that information to yourself.
Right. It's a lot of untapped mana on other people's turns. You only playing when it's necessary to play to help protect yourself. At a certain point, people will probably just stop attacking you because it'll almost always be not worthwhile.
It'll be moot.
Right. But I mean, there's quite a few cards that usually end up turning the tables, right? So in 1v1 fog decks, there's maybe a lot of bounce, maybe a lot of removal or something like that to try and keep yourself alive. Sometimes it's life gain. But I think you're kind of talking about in a very combat-focused Commander, it's not so much about removing the board, it's about using people's creatures to your own benefit.
Right, and I think this is something that's overlooked in Commander often, which is using your opponent's creatures to have them attack your opponents. Because if they're spending resources to defeat the other opponents, they are in fact helping you.
Right.
And so playing their creatures to the board and attacking your opponents is actually beneficial to you. So if you're playing things like Farewell or Wrath of God or Day of Judgment, these things that destroy all the creatures, you're actually hurting yourself because you are destroying some of your resources, which are your opponent's creatures.
And especially because it's a lot more expensive. So you playing Farewell versus just playing a fog is what's cheaper, right?
Right, and it's a sorcery, so you had to tap out on your turn. You're now wide open. There's all these things that happen because you have spent this a very large amount of mana to destroy everybody's creatures.
Right.
So the other thing that ends up happening is you played it on your turn, and now everybody else gets to play something before you.
Yeah.
So if you're working with a one-turn fog, which can effectively time walk somebody, if their whole turn was let me have a really big combat step and attack you, and you're like, nope. Let's talk about how Turbo Fog decks won in Standard.
Sure.
Now, most of the time it was through milling your opponent out. Where you would effectively nullify their creatures that are attacking you, either through life gain, either through, you would play things like Wrath of God in that deck. You would also play a bunch of fog effects, so every time they tried to attack you, they weren't doing any damage.
Right.
And then you would play something like Nephalia Drownyard or Millstone, or these cards that slowly mill your opponent out, similar to Lantern Control in a way, where you're just letting the structures of the game defeat your opponent for you.
Which I think is interesting. I think it's interesting. It sounds, to me, it sounds maybe a little bit less annoying than Lantern Control, because Lantern Control is just like, well, if any card I want to play or that would be beneficial, that's
don't
just
even
going to go
it.
away.
Yeah.
At least Fog, you get to play things,
Yeah.
which can be a threat. That can be a somewhat dangerous thing, potentially. Now, obviously, if the Fog deck is really good, maybe it's just going to bounce it right back. Maybe it's going to wipe the board. Maybe it won't matter and damage will always be prevented, or they're going to be at such a high amount of health that you'll never make a dent, basically. But I like that the opportunity, because you can mill someone out and win the game that way, presents itself, the opportunity that like you could just win by essentially just surviving longer.
Yeah, like you're outliving your opponent. Yeah. Some things to keep in mind about like the play style and the strategy that's involved in playing a Fog deck. You have to have a pretty deep knowledge of what cards are acceptable in what mode, I guess, right? Like if they're playing particular creatures, they might have some spells that might be able to do enough damage to you at an opportune moment to make you lose the game. So you sort of have to weigh like, okay, well, can I let this damage through and not Fog now and wait? Or do I need to make sure that I don't go down to a certain life total? Like you still have to have a pretty deep understanding of all the cards that are possible. I think in a commander setting, that's probably also true. There's still cards that make it so that damage can't be prevented or things like that, where those probably are pretty rare in terms of being in people's decks. But if you were to play this deck and it sort of becomes infamous amongst your group, people could easily put in cards like that to sort of ruin your day. The other thing that doesn't really work in Commander that works in 60 card is milling people out. You could do it.
You could do it. It's just a lot harder. It's similar to
much more difficult.
Similar to an aggro deck problem. And with milling, it's that even more so.
Yeah, I mean, you're milling almost 300 cards to win the game. You're probably looking towards some of the alternative win conditions that Fog decks played, which is stuff like the Guild Gates. There's a I forget what the card's called, but like you get all the Guild Gates in play and you win the game.
Yeah.
There's stuff like, well, it's banned right now. Coalition Victory might be a good option if it becomes unbanned.
For some reason it's banned.
Approach of the Second Sun. It's another good option, which is, you play it once and play it again and you win the game. But I will say that these wins are not... A lot of people don't like this.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't like these play patterns.
What's the one creature when it enters battlefield, if you have life to 40 or more, you win the game?
Felidar Guardian?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. These are some things to think about. The other ways that you could potentially win the game, this gets us to some of the really interesting Fog effects that might be things to look towards. There's things like Ink Shield is probably the most famous in Commander, is that you prevent all damage, and then for each 1 damage you prevented that way, you get a 2/1 creature with flying.
Right.
So they attack you for 20, and you prevent it all, and then turn around and attack them for 40 on your turn. So
Does Fog let you use it for other people's combat phases?
Sure could.
Okay, so you can protect other people's creatures too.
Yeah, you can mess up everybody's day.
Right. So we talked about the whole guns versus butter thing. It's more of like a economic theory terms, but essentially it's either you are investing your resources to make guns or make butter, which is card draw, card advantage, mana advantage, board advantage, like any sort of additional advantage that will help you win the game later on.
Right, so normally in game terminology, guns would be a potentially effective strategy because you could use those guns to then take resources from other people.
Right.
But in Magic, like you can't do that. It would be something like, I'm going to destroy your creature, but instead of destroying it, I get control of it.
Right. If you're playing a game of Civ 6 or something like that, and you go and take someone's city, you then get their city and their territories. But that's not in Magic. Therefore, it only benefits the player to not engage unless they have to engage. So I was looking at, I was just perusing Moxfield, just cursorily, not like super deep, but I found like a couple of commander decks that were uploaded, and there's a legendary creature that people use as a commander that just has like a fog ability attached to them for like 3 mana. His name is Angus Mackenzie.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know Angus?
Yeah.
You go way back. So Angus Mackenzie, he's a legendary creature, human cleric, green, white, blue, 2/2 stats, and you pay a green, white, blue and tap him to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. There you go. And I think what's funny is like looking at this type of a deck, I think that a lot of people would assume like, well, that's the commander that you use. You're making a fog deck, therefore you should have this fog commander. Like that's what you should do.
Right.
Wrong. Don't do that.
Right.
What you do, get the colors you need, figure out that, and then find the commanders that's going to give you either mana or card draw or whatever it is that
Or
you
win
need.
you the game. That's
or
it.
win you the game, whichever.
Those are the three things that a commander can be. If it's anything else, you're probably wasting your time.
Right. Now, that being said, obviously, if you want to have a silly fog-themed deck, absolutely. Have Angus Mackenzie.
Sure.
He seems like a wonderful person. Put him in your deck. If you want to try and make sure that like the fog strategy might be somewhat viable, a lot of the times you're going to probably need to find how can you end up getting that advantage somehow. So yeah, Rhystic Study, probably having a lot of card draw in some way, or mana advantage or whatever that might be.
So I have a deck I have a Kawain deck that's called Miracle Whip, which is sort of a group hug deck that plays miracle spells. This would be a very good shell for a fog deck in that I don't really care that my opponents are getting extra cards because I can play a single card that nullifies. As long as they're playing mostly creatures, they're playing combat-focused commander, I don't care how many creatures they have in play. I'm just going to fog if they attack me. So not only am I currying favor because I'm helping and giving other people cards, but then you're probably not going to attack me anyway because I'm probably just going to fog. And then eventually you win the game through taking infinite turns or, whatever.
You fool. Quain is blue-white.
It's true.
How are you going to fog?
Well, you're right. I have to Holy Day. It's a little different. But I will say that Kawain does miss out on some of the best fogs because some of the best ones are
in green.
Well, fog itself is in green, but also things like Batwing Broom. This card's fucking sick.
Oh yeah. That's the black-white one.
Yeah, well, it's white, and then if you pay black as part of the cost, then you get to deal damage equal to the creatures that were attacking.
Right.
And then Ink Shield is also white-black. Before you ruin your entire commander night, maybe we should have a little disclaimer here that this is a very evil way to play the game, and most people aren't going to like this. So...
Yeah. What I like about it... Okay, so here's the thing that I like about it. If you were... Not that Lantern Control is something that's even viable in Commander, because that's even harder to try and pull off, I think.
Yeah, it's not possible.
But, right. So what I like about it is that it's the defensive strategy that leans into the systems that Commander incentivizes you to lean into. But it doesn't suddenly... it's not... At some point when you're playing Lantern Control, there's this moment that opponents seem to have where they're like, I just can't win. I realize that based off of the cards you have and the possibilities I have, I'm a skilled enough player to recognize when I am locked out. And I feel like Fog still has the opportunity in a way that you can interact, sort of.
Yeah, and this is one of the big issues with this archetype is that you can basically have the game locked up and no one knows.
No one knows because it's all in your hands.
It's all hidden information.
Right.
Where, with something like Lantern Control, that stuff, those are permanents in play. They can see okay, well, you're going to be able to mill 4 or 5 cards to see if any of those matter, and I'll have to have 5 cards in a row that can get me out of this prison. So it's not really... And it's only one opponent.
You're right. We should bring Land Destruction back.
So the card that we referenced earlier that does see play in CEDH is the card Angel's Grace. This is one that's basically says that you can't lose the game, your opponents can't win the game. Silence falls into this a little bit too, but silence is more like
it's just
make it so they can't play spells.
Can't play spells for the rest of the turn or something.
Yeah. That's more like I'm gonna win, so I'm gonna play silence and then go off and nobody can counter me. All right, so that's about it for fogs. If we're evil people that you would never play with at your commander table, let us know. That's our goal, right? We're just let's make the most evil commander deck possible.
Nah. Maybe.